Hello and welcome to class. Hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to go over Chapter 10. We're almost at the end of this semester, so only a few more weeks left. So Chapter 10 discusses management and supervision of sex offenders in the community. So this is a long chapter, has a lot of good information, some things you need to know about. We'll go over this stuff, and again, make sure you read the entire chapter, okay? If you have any questions, let me know. You can post any questions on the discussions tab or email me. All right, here we go. So basically, this chapter really talks about the registration and the community notification laws, or RCNL, basically registration laws. Registration means that a person has to go down to the local police or sheriff department. If they live in the county, they go to the sheriff's department. If they live in the city, they go to the police department. And if they're a registered sex offender, they must register every year on their birthday, within 5 days of their birthday. And they have to provide their address and other information so that they can be tracked or found if there's some issues in the community that police or sheriff need to know about. If there's a sex offense, they can look these people up about where they were at. So that's what the registration means. And in California, there's some legislation right now about registration being for life for sex offenders, but they're looking at lessening that to make it for a certain period of time, maybe 5 or 10 years for certain crimes. So we'll stay tuned and see what happens with that in California. Okay, so the first Sex Registration Act was in 1990 in Washington State. So that wasn't too long ago, but that was the first time that it enacted someone to register with the local police department. There were 14 provisions for increasing sanctions and regulatory monitoring of sex offenders in this state. So they really started to crack down in Washington back in the 90s as far as sex offenders, and we'll tell you why and how this spread across the United States, and different states enacted different types of registration laws. So there are 7 federal sex offender legislation acts, which we'll talk about, okay? And then each state has their own sex registration laws or acts. You need to know about these acts, okay, because they're very important, especially if you go into law enforcement or working with these offenders. It's very important to know these things. So the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and SVP Registration Act, or Sexually Violent Predator Act, was passed in 1994 in regards to Jacob Wetterling. This act requires each state to create a registry of offenders convicted with sexual offenses. So there's a database of all offenders in the state that law enforcement can look up. So again, you can read more about this case, and I encourage you to read about each of these cases. Google these folks' names so you can get the backstory about what happened to them and why this came into play. Megan's Law, hopefully you've heard about that. This was Megan Conca, and again, you should read her story. It's an interesting story. It's a sad story, but this basically requires notification about high-risk sex offenders that are living in the community, and this was from New Jersey. The Pam Leichner Sex Offender Tracking Identification Act was in 1996, and this established the National Sex Offender Registry. This is the first national database that would be overseen by the FBI. So now you have a national database, not just a state database. The Protection of Children from Sexual Predators Act in 1998. This act enabled the Bureau of Justice Assistance to assist states in complying with registration requirements. So it specified offenses and focused on behaviors in trafficking and internet crimes. A lot of acts so far. The Campus Sex Crimes Act of 2000 basically requires registered sex offenders, to notify institutions of higher education that they attend or employment at about their status as a sex offender. So at Sac State, there could be registered sex offenders in a classroom sitting right next to you, and you wouldn't even know about it. but the school knows about it. Okay, and again, not that that's a big deal, because sex offenders are people too, and they have a right to go to school. The PROTECT Act of 2003. You can read about this. The goal is to prevent abduction and eliminate sexual exploitation of children. So it does a few things. The main thing that it did, it created a national Amber Alert. And again, you can read the story about Amber Hagerman in Texas. Terrible story, but this is why we have the Amber Alert, because of her. Again, I encourage you to read up on each of these cases to get the background on this. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act. Do you know who Adam Walsh is? His dad's pretty famous because of what happened to him. Again, I encourage you to do some research on this and what this act did. Basically, the goal of this act is to provide uniform guidelines on the supervision, management, and punishment of sex offenders nationally. Legal challenges to the registration laws. It's been challenged on 4 key areas where the sex offender attorneys thought that the laws might not be constitutional. First of all was double jeopardy, and that basically means being charged 2 times for the same crime. Next was ex post facto application of the law, which means the law was created after the crime, and therefore that should not happen. You should not face additional problems because of a crime that you committed, and now there's a new law about it. The bill of attainder, basically inflicting punishment against members of a group without judicial process. So the sex offender attorneys, that when this was brought up, said that they are being basically punished without judicial process. Okay, they've already served their time for their offense, but now they have to register. And the fourth one was Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment. So far, those 4 have been challenged. But as of yet, no court has determined that these laws were unconstitutional. So sex offender registration laws are constitutional. The book does a good job talking about risk assessment instruments. And a risk assessment instrument basically predicts an offender's reoffending possibilities, generally violently and sexually. Now, when we talk about risk offender instruments, it's only an instrument, and it can predict some, but it does not predict all. Some examples of risk assessment instruments, as you can see, is the Sex Offender Risk Appraisal Guide, the Rapid Risk Assessment of Sexual Offense Recidivism. We in California use the Static 99 or the Static 2002. Scores in these instruments show that an offender is of low, medium, or high risk to reoffend sexually. The only issue is that most of these types of instruments only review males, not females, which is interesting. This is what we use in California, the Static 99. So if you become a parole agent or a probation officer, or you work with clinicians, you may be filling this out, okay? And it's pretty simple. Put their name, the place of scoring where you're doing this, the date, and your name, and the risk factors are on the left, and then the scores or points you assessed are on the right. So if you look down on this, if the person's young, shows an age group, if you ever lived with somebody, prior sex offenses, prior sentencing dates, stranger victims, male victims. So you add up those points, and it will give you at the bottom a risk category, depending on how many points. If you have 2 to 3, you're moderate low. 4 to 5, you're a moderate high. 6+ points, you're a high risk. So therefore, people are supervised in the community depending on this score. So if you're a low risk, you're not going to be supervised as closely. And if you're a high risk, you may be put on a GPS ankle monitor. So again, this Static 99 is pretty simple, but again, it's just a guide. It does not mean that the person's not going to reoffend. Okay, it's just a guide. Some risk factors for reoffense: poor social support within the community, attitudes tolerant of sexual assault, having an antisocial lifestyle, not conforming to the norms or ways and means of the local community, poor self-management strategies, can't hold a job, doesn't get along with people, difficulties with complying with supervision, sexual deviancy as measured by a penile, you can figure that word out, PPG, you'll, let me see, you'll see that term, plethysmograph, PPG. You'll see it in an upcoming video. Okay. History of sex crimes, failure to complete treatment, psychopathy. So again, some of these are risk factors for reoffense. Not all. Some sex offenders may have one, but probably not all. The Sex Registration Act. This has been shown to be prohibitively expensive for states to enact. So it takes time, it takes person power, and it takes a lot of intricacies within databases to have a sex registration set up. Most states will not comply with this because it's of the cost or on principle. So that's why they get federal funds to do this. Unintended consequences of registration. It does cause a stigma to sex offenders. It can cause loss of relationships, and it can cause loss of employment and housing, because you can only live in a certain area if you're a registered sex offender, and you can't be employed in some areas if you're a sex offender. So these laws are not implemented based on evidence or best practices. It was strictly done to protect the community. So many sex offenders live in disadvantaged neighborhoods in clusters where they can live. So in some areas where they can't live near schools, within 2,000 feet of a school or playground, or where children congregate, they can't live anywhere in that area. So they have to live out under a bridge or somewhere that's obviously not habitable. So there are some discrimination issues when it comes to consequences of being a registered sex offender. So therefore, parole agents and probation officers have to work with these folks in order to ensure that they have some sort of housing while increasing community safety. So it's a two-pronged approach. Again, we talked about residence restrictions. Think about where you live. Do you live near a park or where children gather, daycare centers? Well, if you're a registered sex offender, you couldn't live there. And what's interesting is a lot of research has been done, and offenders do not offend where they are near where they live. So it's a big quandary for sex offenders. Okay. Limiting places where sex offenders live, restrictions. Some people say put them in their own colonies where they all are the same. That sounds like discrimination to me. Actually, this may increase offending, as sex offenders now living in a marginalized area. That means away from family or transportation or support. What are they to do? So it's a big quandary, and there is some discrimination when it comes to housing sex offenders. GPS monitoring is a relatively new source of supervision. It can be active, passive, and there's hybrid monitors. The book talks about these. More than half the states use GPS to monitor offenders. California does use this on most of their sex offenders, especially on their high-risk sex offenders. Takes a lot of money and resources. So parole agents have to monitor their folks. They could have 50 people, 50 sex offenders. They have to monitor, or what's called tracks, on their GPS devices every day. They have to get out their computer or their laptop and literally track their offenders on a map to make sure they're not going in inclusion areas where they're not supposed to be. And the GPS monitoring cannot prevent crimes from occurring. All it can do is track. It can be active, though. It can happen right now, real time, or it can be passive. It can track somebody and you can look, 2 days from now and see where they've been. It's useful in helping track offenders' movements, but it takes a lot of time. you don't know what the offender's doing, even if they are where they're supposed to be. There are some safeguards. Once the the ankle monitor, has been cut or tampered with, it sends an alarm to the parole agent, and the parole agent responds to that area. It doesn't necessarily reduce offending, but it does help in the number of sex offenders that abscond or take off without notifying their parole agent because they're being tracked. So if the parolee who's a sex offender does not show up for an appointment with their parole agent, they still have their monitor on. They can just monitor where they're at and then go to them and arrest them for failure to show up for an appointment or discuss things with them. The containment approach, the book talks about that, and then you're going to have a PowerPoint on that. It's a victim-centered collaborative approach for agencies involving supervision of sex offenders and consists of 5 tenets. And I was involved in this when I was in the parole division, and it worked very well. It takes a lot of resources and a lot of cooperation between different agencies and people, but it does work. And the overall goal is community and victim safety. And it individualizes the case management for each offender, because each offender is different. Each offender has different risks and needs, so the containment approach can be tailored for a specific type of sex offender. And it's a multidisciplinary approach. Like I said, it's many agencies that are involved. And again, you'll get a whole PowerPoint on this. And as you see, it's a big pyramid as it's laid out to show who does what in this approach to contain the sex offender from committing more crimes. And again, we'll talk about that, or you'll see this on a PowerPoint you're going to get today. Reentry and reintegration. Limiting the rights of sex offenders can actually increase sex offender recidivism. Because if you can't live somewhere, you can't work anywhere, you can't go certain places, it's pretty exasperating. So again, reentry is very important for all people getting out of prisons, but especially for registered sex offenders, because you have to look at housing, employment, recreation, pro-social relationships with others. One thing that came up when I was a parole agent in Marysville was a sex offender wanted to go to church, and he couldn't go to church because that's where children congregate. So he said that was against his civil rights, and he had a big lawsuit that went on. And the court deemed that he could not go to church because that's where children were congregating. Just like a daycare center, he could not live near there. So again, a lot of issues with reintegration and reentry. Basically, you got to treat a sex offender just like anybody else on your caseload if they're on probation or parole, and assist them and be their advocate for them. Okay, that's chapter 10. Again, it's a good chapter, long chapter. Make sure you read about the federal policies and the acts that we went over and the registration of sex offenders. And again, the containment approach will be in a different PowerPoint for you. Okay, if there's anything else, please let me know. Post in the discussion tab or email me. And you have a great day.